Hey guys, welcome back to The Last Hike, and today I'll show you what the top of Half Dome did to a reckless young couple who stepped off safe footing just to take a photo they thought was cute. They were experienced, careful, deeply in love, and had taken that same picture on a dozen hikes before, but one small step past the edge is all it took, and by the end you'll see how little that rock forgives. It was the 9th of July, 2022, on the broad granite top of Half Dome in Yosemite National Park, about 8,800 feet above sea level, where a young couple from California had pulled themselves up the steel cables that help hikers up the last and steepest stretch of that rock and out onto the wide, flat top. They had come, as they always did, to take one photograph of the two of them together, and to get it the way they wanted it, they walked away from the crowd near the cables and out toward the southwest edge, overlooking Yosemite Valley, onto the open granite where the top of the dome rolls away toward the drop. By the time the afternoon was over, everything that made that day worth remembering had been turned into something their friends can no longer bear to look at. Their names were Emilio Salas, who was 26, and Iris Kwan, who was 24, and they had been together a little over 4 years. Emilio had grown up in Merced, in the flat farm country an hour and a half west of the park, and Iris had grown up in Fremont, on the eastern edge of the bay, and they had met as students at the university in Merced and stayed in California afterward because they had fallen in love with the same thing, the long weekends in the high country that were close enough to reach on a Friday night and big enough to make the rest of life feel small for a while. The first thing the people who knew them will tell you is that they were not the kind of couple you would expect to find in a story like this, and they say it almost angrily, because the easy version of this tale, the reckless young people who had it coming, is not the one that is true. They were careful, they were fit, and they had spent years hiking the Sierra together, long days on hard trails, the sort of hikers who carried more water than they needed and turned around when they said they would. Somewhere early on, they had started a small tradition, a single photograph of the two of them at the top of every hike they finished, always the same way, the two of them together with whatever view they had earned that day behind them, taken on a self-timer so that no stranger ever had to hold the camera. Over 4 years, they had built up a quiet collection of those photos, one hike at a time, and to the handful of friends and family who followed along, it had become the sweetest running record of a relationship anyone had seen. Half Dome was meant to be one of the big ones, a photo they had talked about for a long time and had waited 2 seasons for the permit to take. Friends describe a couple who planned their trips down to the water and the daylight, who read the trip reports, who knew that people got hurt on that hike and talked about it the way careful people do, as something that happened to those who cut corners. It is important to say plainly that nothing about who they were pointed to how this ended, and that is exactly what makes it so hard to tell. You can still see the tradition if you go looking, because they had shared those photos with a small circle for years, and the people who loved them have kept them up. There is the two of them on a wind-scoured pass in the eastern Sierra, and on a granite slab above a lake, and on a dozen smaller hikes, always the same pose, always a little breathless, always laughing at whatever the timer had caught. There is a message Iris sent her sister the morning of the hike, a plain and happy note that they had finally drawn a Half Dome permit and were going for it, with a line about how this one was going to be the best photo yet. There is nothing in any of it that reads as reckless. It reads as two people who had found a way to mark the good days and had done it safely dozens of times, right up until the one place where the ground itself would not forgive the smallest mistake. There is even a short clip from a hike the autumn before of the two of them laughing because the timer had gone off early and caught them still scrambling into place. And you can hear how easy they were with each other, how many times they had done this small ritual. Watching all of it now, knowing what the rock was quietly waiting to do is a heavy and disorienting thing, because none of it looks like the prologue to a tragedy. It looks like a life being happily, ordinarily lived. Photos have a quiet way of pulling people out to the very edges that kill them up there, and I need you to understand exactly why before I take you any further into this. To understand what happened, you have to understand the place, because Half Dome is not a normal hike, and the cables are not a normal trail. After miles of hiking up through forest and over a smaller dome, hikers reach the base of the final stretch, a bare granite face that rises the last 400 feet at an angle steep enough that no one could walk it on their own. To get people up it, each season the park installs 2 steel cables between metal posts with thin wooden slats laid across the rock every 10 feet or so to stand on, and hikers haul themselves up hand over hand between the 2 cables. For the few months each year the cables are up, it is open to anyone with a permit, and most experienced hikers carry grippy work gloves for it, and on a clear summer day, a steady line of people goes up and down it, experienced hikers and first-timers, and the occasional family group among them, which is part of what makes it feel so much safer than it is. A crowd on a dangerous place has a way of convincing everyone in it that the danger cannot be real. What almost none of them grasp is how little forgiveness the rock offers up top. The granite is polished by glaciers, by weather, and by generations of hikers. It is pitched at an angle that gives your feet almost nothing to trust. And just past the edges of the route, it curves away toward drops of thousands of feet with nothing in between. The cables are not a convenience. On that face, they are the only thing standing between a person and a fall. And park rangers regularly remind hikers that the cables are their main protection on that final slope, and that stepping outside them, or getting on the rock when it is wet, sharply raises the risk. The park does not hide any of this. The permit itself comes with warnings. The trailhead signs warn about falls and the lightning in plain language. And every year the same advice goes out: keep both hands on the cables, never get on the rock when it is wet, and turn around without shame if the weather moves in. People still die there, and when they do, it is almost never because the hike was too hard. It is because the rock at the top is far less forgiving than the long, ordinary trail that leads up to it lulls them into believing.
Granite up there is nothing like the honest rock you scramble on lower down, and I want you to understand how little it takes to lose your footing on a slope that only looks like it's walkable.
They did almost everything right. They had drawn one of the permits that the park hands out, keep the crowds down, they started before sunrise to beat the heat, and they carried the leather palmed gloves that regulars wear on the cables, and more water than they needed, and the kind of quiet competence that comes from years of doing this. Other hikers who shared the trail with them that morning remembered an easy, friendly couple moving well, in no particular hurry, plainly happy to be there. The afternoon was building the way Sierra afternoons often do in July, with clouds gathering over the high country and the light going flat, but it was not storming when they reached the top. Plenty of people were still going up and down the cables around them, and the granite they would step onto was dry. Nothing marked it as the day that would go wrong. They pulled themselves up the cables without trouble, hand over hand, pausing on the wooden slats to let faster hikers pass, doing everything the way the signs ask. They joined the scatter of hikers resting on the broad top, that strange flat island of granite where the danger seems to vanish the moment you stand up on it. For a little while, they were just two more happy people at the end of a long hike up, catching their breath, taking in a view no photograph does justice to, and looking for the right place to take the one they had come for.
Cables are the part of that hike everyone fears, and I want you to sit with the fact that these two already had beaten that stretch and were standing safely on the flat top when the real danger found them.
The top of Half Dome is wide and flat enough that most people never feel they are in danger once they are up there, and that sense of safety is exactly the trap. The true edges, the places where the granite rolls over into the enormous sheer face, are not fenced, and though signs warn people back from parts of them, the rock leans toward them so gently at first that people wander much closer than they realize. To get their photograph the way they always took it, with the two of them together and the whole valley falling away behind them and none of the crowd in the frame, they walked well away from the cables and out toward the southwest edge overlooking Yosemite Valley, the lip that drops straight into the canyon. By the accounts of the hikers who noticed them, they propped their phone on a low rock, set it to fire on a timer, and stepped out together onto the open, curving granite near the rim to get into position. It was the same thing they had done on a dozen safe hikes, the same small choreography of setting the camera and stepping back and finding the light. It was not the same rock, and nothing about the way it looked told them so. Out toward that edge, the granite is glacially polished, canted at an angle that gives the feet almost nothing to trust. Slick enough, even bone dry, that footing is never a sure thing. To the eye, it looked no different from the safe granite a little way behind them, and that is the cruelest thing about that particular rock. There is no line painted on it, no change in color, nothing that marks the exact place where the friction they have trusted their whole lives quietly stops being enough. They had stood near the edges of big drops before and been fine, dozens of times, and every one of those times had taught them, wrongly, that this one would be fine too. Almost everything about those final minutes is known because the phone survived, having stayed on the rock where they had propped it rather than going over the edge with them. And, after the investigation, the park returned it to their families with the images intact. The camera had been set the way they always set it for these, a timer that triggered a rapid burst of shots so they could pick the best frame later. The earlier shots in the burst show the two of them stepping out and turning to face the camera, finding the spot, getting close together the way they always did. The timestamps place it in the early afternoon, under that flat and heavy light. The last shots in the burst do not show a pose at all. One shows only granite and sky at a wrong and tilting angle, and the one after it shows nothing that was meant to be a photograph. The burst simply ran on to its end after there was no longer anyone in front of it, and then it was over. That gap between the last frame with two people in it and the empty ones that close the burst is the whole shape of what happened, laid out in timestamps and nothing more. It is the closest thing to a record that exists of the final moment, and it captured only what a camera can, which is everything except the part that matters most.
Fan Sam commented that those cables always remind them of the bottleneck on Everest, and I think everyone watching has felt that same fear even just looking at them. But trust me, later you'll see why the cables are not what you should be afraid of here. What the hikers back on the cables saw, they have described the same way to the rangers and to one another ever since. The couple was standing together on the open granite near the rim, close, arranged for the camera, when one of them suddenly began to slide on that polished, canted rock. From where the other hikers stood, dozens of feet back and busy with their own footing, no one could say what set it off, only that one of the two abruptly went down and started sliding. They appeared to have stepped onto one of the steeper, convex stretches where the granite rolls over toward the face, and on ground that steep and that polished a slide does not stop on its own with nothing to catch it. The two of them were standing close together, and moments later, the second began to slide as well. Witnesses said it happened in the time it takes to draw a breath, too fast for anyone near enough to do a single thing but watch. Several of them said afterward that they had heard almost nothing until people began shouting, and then the top was simply empty where two people had been standing a moment before. People who were there that day have said the silence right after was the part they cannot forget. The way a crowded granite top went from ordinary chatter to something none of them had words for. Several of them did not go back to finish their own photos. A few have said they have not been able to look at pictures from their own hike since. Yosemite loses people almost every season, and it's rarely the ones you would expect, which is something I keep coming back to every single time I tell one of these stories. For a moment, the top of the dome went silent, and then it turned into the particular chaos of a place where something terrible has happened and no one can reach it. Other hikers shouted, some started back down the cables to raise the alarm, and someone managed to reach a ranger, though on that rock, even the fastest possible response is measured against terrain that fights every single step of a rescue, and against a fall that had already answered the only question that mattered. The park's search and rescue team, among the fastest and most practiced anywhere, launched quickly, but reaching the base of the wall far below the rim is slow, roped, dangerous work, and the recovery operation continued into the evening and was completed after dark. Back at the top, the phone still sat on its low rock, its burst long since finished, and it would become one important piece of the physical evidence of a thing that had happened faster than any person could follow. What no one on that top could do was change a single part of it, and that helplessness is a thing the people who were there have carried since. Rescues on Half Dome are among the hardest the park runs, because the same steep, smooth rock that makes a fall so deadly makes reaching the bottom of it slow and dangerous work, with the day burning away the whole time. By the time the light started to go, it was clear the couple who had come up to take one more photo were already beyond any help that anyone could give, and the effort had turned from a rescue into the long, careful work of bringing two people home. 2 seconds is all it took. And I've gone over those 2 seconds more times than I can count, looking for the single place where it could have all gone a better way. It is worth being clear about why a slip up there is so different from a slip anywhere else, because it is the whole reason this happens the way it does. On flat ground, a stumble is nothing. On the pitched, glacially polished granite out toward the edge, a body that starts to slide keeps sliding, because the friction that holds you there is thin even when the rock is bone dry, and there is no meaningful ledge, no feature capable of stopping a sliding body, nothing at all in the way to arrest it. The dome curves as it goes, so the slope only steepens toward the edge, and past that edge, the rock falls away in a sheer wall that runs down thousands of feet to the broken rock below. It is a geometry that turns a harmless stumble into something with no bottom to it, and it is why park records document repeated fatalities on that feature over the decades, almost always in the same few ways. It is why the rangers are so blunt about keeping both hands on the cables, about staying between them, about not going up at all when the rock is wet, and about how quickly a clear morning can turn into a dangerous afternoon. None of it is fussiness. Every major safety warning on that hike is written in the plainest language the park can manage, precisely because the people who break it are so rarely the careless ones. They are far more often the fit, the experienced, and the confident. People whose own good judgment on 100 easier places has quietly taught them that the warnings are meant for someone else. It is the plain physics of a place where the difference between a good photograph and a fatal fall can be a single square foot of stone and 1 degree too much lean, and where the ground gives no second try to anyone who guesses wrong. Friction is the only thing holding a person to that dome, and I promise you, it gives out faster and far more quietly than anyone believes until they feel it start to go. It has to be said plainly that no one was standing beside them at the very edge, and this account will not pretend otherwise.
What is known was pieced together from a handful of honest sources, from the hikers still on the cables who watched the two of them step out onto the open granite and saw the slide, from the phone that was found still propped on its rock with its burst of frames and its timestamps intact, from the locations far below where the search team recovered them, and the exact spot on the rim where the phone still sat, from the weather logged over the high country that afternoon, and from the county sheriff's office, which acts as coroner and later examined them. Investigators used those fixed points to lay out the plain shape of what happened, the stepping out, the slide, the fall, and no more than that, because the evidence does not stretch any further and no honest account would force it to. What no one can tell you, and what this channel will not pretend to know, is what either of them was thinking in those last seconds, or what passed between them as they set up the shot, because the phone recorded images and light and time and never once recorded a mind. Emilio Salas and Iris Kwan died in the fall from the granite just below the top of Half Dome on a July afternoon at the end of a hike they had done nearly everything right to prepare for. They were recovered by the park's search and rescue team from the rock far below the rim, and the county sheriff's office, acting as coroner, attributed both deaths to the injuries of a fall from a great height and ruled them accidental. There was no failure of gear, because they had used none where it happened, and no wild recklessness of the kind that makes a story easy to file away as someone else's mistake. There was only a couple who walked out to an unfenced edge on a wide, friendly-looking top for a reason as ordinary and as human as wanting a nice picture of themselves onto rock that does not measure intentions. No one saw the exact instant either of them went over the edge, and no honest telling will claim to. What is certain is the ending. By that evening, both of them were gone, and the photo they had hiked all that way to take was never taken at all. The investigation that followed concluded that the deaths resulted from an accidental fall from steep granite terrain, which is its own kind of hard because there is no villain to point to and no lesson that feels big enough for the loss. In its seasonal warnings, the park kept making the same quiet point, that the danger on Half Dome is not the effort of the hike but the rock at the top, and that many of the serious falls up there began with someone doing something that felt perfectly safe a second before it was not. Park safety messaging has repeatedly warned hikers against leaving safer terrain in search of a better photograph, and rangers have watched again and again how a fall can begin with someone stepping a little past the safe line for a better frame. An ordinary and understandable step almost every time, because you cannot put a railing on the whole of the wild and you cannot make people afraid of ground that has always, until the last second, felt perfectly solid. The phone, with its long tradition of photos from the top of every hike and its terrible final sequence, was given back to the families, who have mostly kept the collection private and asked that the last frames never be shared. Among the small circle who had followed the two of them from hike to hike, the running record simply stopped, one hike short of the one they had been most excited to add. There was no scandal to it, no viral spread, no arguments in the comments, because they had never been famous and had never wanted to be. There was only a quiet, private grief, shared among the people who had watched a relationship grow one hike at a time and who now had a collection that ended mid-sentence. It is a smaller, lonelier kind of loss than the ones that make the news, and in some ways a heavier one. Rangers along the Half Dome Trail repeat the same warnings every summer, and I wish more of us would hear them as something other than noise meant for people less careful than we believe ourselves to be. I have thought a long time about how to tell this without turning Emilio and Iris into a warning label, because they deserve better than that, and because the truth is more useful anyway. They were not fools. They were careful, experienced, deeply in love, and undone by the single most human impulse there is, the wish to hold on to a good moment and take it home with them. That is the part that should stay with us, not the false comfort that they were careless and we would never be, because that comfort is a lie, and it is the exact lie that puts the next careful, confident person a step too far out onto the rock. Almost all of us have leaned a little too far, stepped a little past the rope, trusted our feet on ground we did not really know for something as small as a photo, and almost all of us have gotten away with it, which is the only real difference between us and them. The rock does not know why you stepped onto it. It does not care whether you were reckless or in love, whether it was your first big hike or your 50th, whether you were showing off or simply trying to remember a good day. It offers everyone who walks out onto it the exact same terms, footing or none, and it collects on those terms without a moment of warning and without any mercy at all. That indifference is terrifying, but it is also, in a strange way, the whole point. The place is not out to get anyone. It is simply permanently honest about what it is, and it leaves all of the deciding and all of the consequences to us. When I first learned of the last real photo saved on their phone,
I understood this was never a story about reckless people. And honestly, that's what makes it the hardest kind to tell.
I do not tell this story to stand over two young people who can no longer speak for themselves, because there is nothing to be gained in that, and because the warning inside it belongs to every one of us who has ever gone to a beautiful place and wanted proof that we were there. Half Dome is still standing, and the cables still go up every summer, and every summer a new line of people hauls themselves to that wide, deceptive top, nearly all of whom never come close to danger. Much of the top edge is still unfenced, because you cannot put a railing around a wild place like that, and though warning signs stand up there, the granite still leans out toward the drop as gently as it did the day these two stepped onto it. The only thing that has changed is that somewhere in a family's home, there is a collection of photographs that ends one hike early, a long, happy record of two people at the tops of their hikes that simply stops, and a last picture that no one will ever take. If there is anything to carry down from a story this sad, it is only this. The moment you feel most safe in a place like that is very often the exact moment it is most able to take everything from you, because the fear that keeps you careful has quietly slipped away right when you still needed it most. No photograph, no view, no perfect frame of a good day has ever been worth the one step past the line, and the hardest part of believing that is that you have to believe it before you are standing there, and not after.